Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining in here today, where we're going to talk a little bit about environmental conditions that affected soybeans, especially in 2018. I have Dave Chappellaz from Thunder Seed, the provincial agronomist, with me here today, and he's going to talk a little bit about both what affected potential yields and also a little bit about herbicide carryover issues we may or may not see. I'll let Dave cover anything I forgot and let him start up with the slides here and we'll get her going.
Perfect. Thanks, Soren. Yeah, thanks to everybody who joined in today and whoever's going to be viewing it online later on. Thank you to Soren and Rebecca for letting me partake in their webinars. I think they've been really good so far with some good uptake. So it's definitely a nice and different way of reaching out to the growers. So it's awesome. I'll just fire up this presentation here. Maybe. Does that work?
That does work, yeah.
All right. So yeah, as Soren said, if you guys have any questions at all as we're rolling through here, feel free to send him your questions, and then we'll definitely go through them. So just to start off, a few things that Soren and I had discussed that we should maybe look at and talk about regarding soybeans and last year, why they yielded okay in some spots and why they didn't yield in other spots. Just a few of the issues that may have arose. So we're going to look at things like plant stand, water use in soybeans, timing and volumes, nutrient availability throughout the season, as well as herbicide residues or herbicide hangovers, how that can affect soybeans, as well as maybe some weed control. So first thing, plant stand establishment. Last year was definitely kind of a challenge. We started off with some pretty dry conditions at planting in a few places. Guys were trying to decide whether they plant at the regular 3/4 inch or do they try and bury it into some moisture. That picture on the right with the shovel there you see was out closer to Winnipeg, but was a guy who put his soybeans down about 2.5 inches to try and get them to moisture in some pretty heavy clay. And of course, within about 4 days of that to a week, he got a big downpour of pounding rain and got everything nice and hard and crusted on top. But so those are all some of the issues that we do see. Seems to be more often than not here. Springs have been challenging. So so one thing, again, we talked about the dry conditions, seeding depth. One thing that we want to keep in mind is the optimum seeding depth for soybeans is at 3/4 inch to 1 inch. We can chase some moisture if we need to a little bit. If anybody's using a planter, usually we see soybean emergence with planters, maybe a little more forgiving than with a drill, for the fact that just the way the seed is placed and how that furrow is closed, you seem to be able to push a little harder or a little easier behind a planter. But that being said, soybeans are still very good at making their way out of the ground. Seed lot conditions, last fall or last spring, we should say, there's some companies that struggled with some dry seed. When we look at the harvest of fall of 17, which produced our seed for this past year, we did have a dry run come fall. We had beans that were drying down really fast. So we did struggle with some seed lots being overly dry. Soybean seed needs at least, I'm just gonna flip ahead here for a second. Yeah, so soybean seed needs at least half of its weight in water to germinate. So that's quite a bit of water and it has to be warm. So those are all things that we're gonna talk a little bit more in the next couple slides, but the biggest thing is they do need a lot of moisture, so we want to make sure that those soils get into it when we're seeding. Worst case scenario, just starts to sprout and runs out of moisture. So that's one thing that we got to watch, is that if you are laying that soybean or those soybean seeds just barely into moisture, under some dry conditions, all of a sudden, if they do have enough to get going and they just run out of steam, they'll just sit there. That's when you can start seeing some soybeans rotting. So set planting rates based on several factors. So the condition of the seed. So if it's dry, you see some seed coats flaking off, maybe at time of treatment, definitely look at or think about increasing your seeding rates. Soren can definitely coach you through too. So as seed lots come into his plant, I'm pretty sure he's keeping an eye on it and what it looks like. At Thunder Seed, what we do is we're pretty strict on some of our tolerances for seed coats and mechanical damage, things like that. So we do make sure that our seed is as good as it can get. Last fall was actually decent enough for seed production, so we got lucky there, and most of our lots are looking really good. Loss from mechanical damage. So one thing that we find is a lot of growers are very good at figuring out planting rates and looking at adding in things like germ percentage. So if it's a 95% germ, they'll increase their seeding rate from what they want their final plant pops to be at by 5%. What we don't see very often is that a lot of growers, unfortunately, they'll see their soybeans or plant their soybeans, and they don't go back in there to see what their final plant stands are at. That's a really critical and important thing to do. Every farm, every drill is different. So there's different levels of mechanical damage that can happen to your soybeans, whether they're hammering through your air seeder, air volumes affecting it, the speed of the seeds going through the manifolds, things like that. So by being able to go back in season and counting the actual plants you have, after a year or two, you can really start dialing in on what rates you were putting down and what you're actually ending up with coming out of the ground. So your mechanical damage, where you thought you might be 10%, once you start counting your stands, maybe you'll see you're more like 15 or 20%. The seeds aren't coming up. So then you got to adjust your initial seeding rate accordingly. So those are all very important things that you got to look at. Environmental conditions, if extreme conditions, drought or wet, you may have to increase those rates again because your survivability won't be quite as good. We talked about that optimum seeding depth, 3/4 of an inch to inch and a quarter. All the data and the studies have shown that that's still where you want to be if you can. The key is to get even emergence. So laying the seed, as we talked about, just at the top edge of that moisture is kind of the worst case scenario, because what's going to happen is you may have some that'll start germinating or sprouting, start growing. You'll have some that's sitting in a bit more dry dirt, so they're not going to get going. So you're going to get some pretty uneven emergence that way. That's going to keep going throughout the season. So it's always a tough decision in the spring. Is do you try and chase the moisture and make sure your beans are right down there, or do you just lay them at 3/4 of an inch or an inch and hope it rains? Those are all things that you kind of have to decide as the season goes. Rely on people around you like Soren, who can tell you and help you as to what has worked in the past, what we think is going to happen weather-wise. If you know there's rain in the forecast and you can get away with planting them a bit shallower, do that. If it looks like it's dry and you know you have a good moisture down at 1.5 or a bit more, well, then maybe that's what you do. You just push it down a little more. But like I said, every farm, every year seems to be different.
Dave, got a couple. I got one comment to this here, and then a question to follow up as well.
Perfect.
So we have done some plant stand counts on farm, myself and growers, over the last few years, and our goal with that is, first of all, we want to make sure we have the perfect plant stand, we have the proper surviving plants there. But the second of all, what we've also looked at is like, okay, if we can improve over 2 or 3 years that we get the survivability that we like, we get that proper plant stand, or if we're even a little high on the high side, we can actually cut back our seeding rate a little bit. And I have noticed a huge variability from one farm to the next. Mm-hmm. And that can be with what we consider are very, very similar drills even. I can't put my finger as to why, but one farm's drill seems to have more seed survive than the next one. It's been key to me when we've done these assessments to be able to know what is our germ on the lots that we have been working with. So we have done it primarily on seed we've sold ourselves, so we know what we're up against, because the certified number one could be anywhere from, I don't think they'd ever give you 100, but 99% germ anyway, and as low as 85. So that would have a huge variability. And I know, especially with underseed, we've always had a very high germ on everything we've gotten in. I think off the top of my head, the lowest we've ever had would be 94% germ. The questions I have here is, what is the deepest you're comfortable seeding soybeans with, Dave? I know for myself, to take my experience into consideration, 1.5 inches seeding depth has been about as deep as I like to go, because when we roll our soybeans, we do end up a little bit deeper than 1.5 inches. We could be as low as 2 inches then. But what's your experience been? Where's your comfort level at, Dave?
Yeah, perfect. That's a good point there about rolling. Once again, every farm is a little different. So like Soren, you mentioned, if you are rolling, that 1.5 inch mark is definitely going to be about the limit, because you are going to push those beans down. The soil conditions or the soil type as well. If you're in some lighter type of soil, sometimes that's a little more forgiving to the beans to be able to push out. If you're in quite some heavy clay soils that are prone to crusting, you may want to keep them a little bit shallower as well, just to get them up and going. Optimum, again, 3/4 inch to 1.25 inches. But last year was the first year that we saw beans going past that 1.5 inch, 1.75 inch mark in quite a few years. And it did work out in some cases. That picture that I showed you earlier with the gentleman that seeded them at about 2.5, 2 3/4 inch. He went from a plant stand of about, he put down about 165, 170,000, and he was down to 100. So it definitely does cost you in the end. So I can't really throw out a number as to, you go to 2 inches, you're good. 2.25, you're going to be in trouble. It's no easy or black and white type of thing. It depends a lot on the soil, the equipment being used. Are you going to roll them, and what the weather is? But I don't know. Hopefully that kind of answers a bit of the question. It's not a black and white type of answer. So.
Well, yes, I understand that. I thought it'd be good to get your feedback on it as well here. So see what your comfort level is at. So
perfect. Varieties and spacing. I'll get into that a little bit. So every variety has a different growth habit. So as you're selecting them and you're going through your variety selections with Soren, you definitely have to take into account, is it going to be a bushy plant when it's growing? Is it very upright? Because that's going to affect your seeding rate. If it's a bushy plant, you can maybe get away with something a little lower on the seeding rate side. It's going to close in your rows. It's going to cover the ground quickly, versus if it's a very narrow and upright bean, you might want to push your seeding rates up a little bit more. The other thing that seeding rate will affect is pod height. If you really start cutting back on seeding rates, sometimes those plants have a lot of room to grow, so they don't stretch up quite as far. So your pod height may be slightly lower than if you'd be using a higher seeding rate. But once again, as you're selecting varieties, Soren can help you through that, and our crew here at Thunder can definitely give you some assistance or some pointers as well as to where we think you should be. Another thing that might affect that too is what kind of rotation was on that field. If you've had a strong canola rotation, and you've got beans going in there, you think you're going to have some white mold pressure, you may want to back off a little bit just to make sure those crops don't get too rank. Those are all things that can affect your seeding rate decisions or spacing and variety selections. Here I'll get a little bit into plant establishment again. Optimum soybean plant stamps in Manitoba is 160,000 established plants per acre. At that rate, you've got 100% yield potential. You've probably got some wiggle room if something happens throughout the season or you lose a few plants. So that's definitely where you want to start. And I mean, that's plants coming out of the ground. So from that point, 160,000, you got to take your germ into effect. So as Soren said, if it's a 95% germ seed, you got to add 5%. From there, if you know you typically lose 15, 20% on your through your system, and I mean from picking up the beans, putting them through an auger, through your drill into the ground. If you think you're going to lose 15%, make sure you increase by 15%. And then that's how you kind of we start getting into that 190, 200 mark, depending on row spacing and variety, of course.
And I can shine a little bit of light on that, Dave, from what we've seen over the years. In naming, so it's putting 210,000 seeds down the tube, not accounting for germ. We usually say we use that 94% germ number, then we're closer to 200 or 202,000, I guess. We end up anywhere between 195 as low as 120,000 surviving, depending on the drill, depending on the conditions. I mean, we all blame the drill, but it is somewhat random where the seed ends up, and some of them end up in good moisture. There'll be the odd one that'll be on top of the ground, maybe depending on the drill, right? But we have seen that wide of a spread, and that is related to, is it augered, is it conveyed into the drill? How is the air distribution on that drill? Is it fairly gentle on the seed, or is there some bouncing around that maybe another drill doesn't have? But yeah, that's kind of the spread we've seen around here.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And you're talking about drills, and that's the same. What kind of speed are you doing? If it's really tough seeding conditions and you're getting a lot of bounce up and down, or you got some seeds that are blowing up a bit, you definitely have to watch that for your populations, your final plant stands. So you can see this chart, which was put out by the Manitoba Pulse Growers Association. If you're at 140,000, you still got 98% of your yield potential there, which is still very good. At 120, you're down to about 95. At 100,000, they say 90% yield potential. That's typically, if we get down to 100,000, is where I'm going to start thinking about a reseed. When you look at 10% yield loss, it's maybe we don't think it's going to be that big of a deal, but it's also going to affect other things. You're going to be having weed issues. You're going to be having competition issues. So we definitely want to keep those plant stands in that 160 range, final emerged plant stands, just to avoid some of those other issues.
Do we run into delayed maturity with those low populations as well, Dave?
Yeah, you definitely can. And once again, it depends on the variety and the season. But if you've got some varieties that like to branch out, they will definitely keep branching out for a while. And then those late, they can definitely finish a little later. We're not talking weeks difference here. It could be a few days. But it will also lead to maybe a little more uneven maturity versus a fuller plant stand. So. And then on that note at the bottom with date, weather conditions, crop stage, all those things should be taken into account in the springtime. So like this gentleman last year, he was down to 100,000 emerged plants. We did some digging. That was about all he was going to get. But being that it was already getting a bit later in the season, it was extremely wet, so he wasn't going to be back in that field for probably at least 10 days. All those things kind of just snowballed, and we said, you know what, we'll leave it at 100,000, and we'll see what we can get. Things that we have done in the past is on lower plant stands. If they're just coming up and you do some digging, try and evaluate what's still going to emerge. If you think that you're going to be below that, we have had people just go in with a disc drill or low disturbance, like a planter, and top up another 20,000 of either the same variety, but typically it'll be a shorter season variety. Those things can be quite challenging because when it comes to harvest time, then you'll have some plants that are ripe and some plants that could potentially still be green. It's kind of a last case or worst case scenario, last ditch effort to save what you have, but those things have been done. All right, so keep going into soybean water use. So 2017 and 18 definitely had some challenges when it came to moisture. You guys all know that. Here's a kind of a summary of what we saw weather-wise in Verdon. So growing degree or crop heat units, we'll look at that. So at 2,504 actual heat units. So you were just over normal on the heat side of things. On the precipitation side of things, same. You guys were 99%. So it was very close to what you normally get, which wasn't the case. The caveat on this is when I was pulling some of these units is we all know how we got our water last year. We had lots of thunderstorms come through. So you can have one area that gets 1.5 inches of rain and the quarter section beside it got nothing. So just because this is the what it says on that specific site where this weather station was, doesn't necessarily mean that's what all areas around Verdon got. So when we start breaking it down into monthly, when did that precipitation come? We do have a little bit of snowfall that showed up in May, but you got 54 mils in May, lots of rain. June, July were kind of our wet months. And then come August, September, we still had decent moisture at this site, and then into October. So you guys know when September rolled around and beans were getting ready to harvest, we're getting a little bit of rain every day. So definitely not significant amounts in one shot, but it added up in the end. So keep these numbers in mind as we keep going over the next few slides here, and we're going to kind of try and piece it all together in the end. Here's a crop water use slide for soybeans. This comes from Laura Schmidt, who's extension coordinator at Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers. So as you can see in the vegetative growth, the tail end of vegetative growth into reproduction, that's when that water use curve really starts to peak. So when we start looking at this, we're thinking, you're getting into July here now, and that's when you really want that rain to start kicking in. And then once again, as we get into September, it's kind of, or end of August even into September, those rains might be too late for some of our varieties. Here's a quick chart on the daily water use for some pulse crops in Manitoba, we'll say. So if you look at germination and seedling with soybeans, you're looking at just a little bit of rain per day. You're looking at 1 to 2.5 mils a day that plant is going to need. But look, if you start getting into the flowering and pod fill, those reproduction stages, it really kicks up here in that 5 to 7 mils a day. So you've got a plant that's pulling in 400 to 500 mils a year to get to its final yield potential. So it's definitely a much higher user of water as compared to peas or dry beans there.
Dave, how would that compare to wheat or canola?
So it's definitely higher than wheat and canola. Like I don't know that one off the top of my head, how many mils a season like canola would use, but soybeans are quite significant. On a per day, they're actually using almost as much as corn. It's just that corn has a longer season, so total over the year it uses more. But it definitely, you look at all of that vegetative growth and it's transpiring quite a bit. So it's going to be higher than wheat and canola, but that exact number I'm not sure.
Okay. I think in previous years I've seen on the canola side anyway, we're around 400 millimeters a year. So yeah, we're a bit ahead, or need a bit more for soybeans, I should say.
Yep. Yeah. These numbers come out of the US, but they'd be very similar for us.
Right.
So now we start digging and we start looking at when that precipitation occurs. So you start looking back and you had 174 millimeters from April till June, 126 from July till August, and then 41 in September. So a total of 341 mils in growing season. This isn't taking into account what was in the soil when we started growing this crop. So I did some quick math. So let's say from germination through the vegetative stage, if you were using 3 millimeters a day times 45 days, you need 135 mils. So that would be that April to June-ish time frame. So we had enough to do that. Then we get into that flowering, 6 mils to 45 days. So 270 millimeters roughly to get the soybeans through that period of its growing cycle. And then we look at July to August in Verdon, we're at 126 mils. So we're definitely short in that season. So when you start looking at soil types, how much water can those soils hold? That's why we may have seen some fields do better than others as well. And then through the maturation period, 2 millimeters times 20 days, you need another 40 mils to finish that. And we had 40 mils in September overall. So we were on average probably pretty close to getting what we needed there at Verdon. A little bit on the short side, especially in that flowering period and pod fill stage. So that could be one of the reasons why we did see some yield reductions in areas. Once again, going back to how we got that rain, it wasn't those nice general 1-inch rains across the whole area. It was a 2-inch downpour in one spot, and half mile down the road or a mile down the road, they didn't get anything. So that's kind of what created the variability as well this year. From one neighbor to the next, there can be quite significant yield, up to 7 or 10 bushels in places. So
and we've had even more extremes around here. Two neighbors with both good looking crops of soybeans, and we were probably 12 bushel difference 2 miles apart. So all the fields were, but that's what we saw all summer long, very, very spotty rains.
Yeah. So that was definitely one of the issues we saw. And when we look at that early, that extra rain earlier on, depending on the soil type it was on, like a loamy sand can hold up to 1 inch and a foot in the top foot of soil. You get into a silty loam or a clay, you're looking more like at a 2.5 inch type of reservoir in a foot of soil there. So that definitely plays into it as well. Then we started looking at how much heat we got. We saw heat unit wise is pretty much the same, or is pretty much 100% of average for you guys there in Verdon. Soybeans love their heat, we know that. So what happens in a really hot summer? So if we got a few of those stretches that were well above 30 and some nice windy, sunny days. So it's great for camping and fishing, but unfortunately, those plants and the soil, we're getting a lot of evaporation, lots of evapotranspiration as well from the plants. So those plants are using a lot more water as the season rolls on. So we definitely do need, in that end of June, July, beginning of August period, that those rains that we get in there are extremely critical. Drought conditions. So we know we're on average, we got the rain that we almost needed, or what you normally get, but it was so spotty that some areas did get some drought conditions. So under those conditions, in vegetative stages, soybeans will spend more energy growing more roots because they're trying to get down to that water that's trapped in the soil, maybe deeper. And then when the soil or the moisture returns, they'll go back to growing above ground. That happens more in longer season crops than are really short ones, but it still does occur. So if we get into that early mid-June and it's really dry, those plants are still putting a lot of energy into rooting. Flowers can also happen earlier than normal because soybeans want to reproduce before their death or before they dry down. So they can start flowering a little earlier. Typically we see flowering start 7-10 days after the solstice, but this can kickstart it to occur a little earlier. Soybeans are also most sensitive to moisture deficits during the late pod development and bean filling periods. So like we've been saying, and I'm sure Soren's been talking to you guys about this as well, is that for soybeans, you need that late July, beginning August rain, that inch to inch and a half, 2 inches. That is a moneymaker. We see huge yield difference from when you get that rain and when you don't. So those are all things that can affect or could have affected what we saw last year when it came to yields. Any concern, any comments on that one, Soren?
Well, one comment on that, and I don't know if you were going to touch on it, but in talking to a seed dealer down from the Boissevain area, they had a customer with soybeans on irrigation, pumping the water out of a slough. He ran out of water during irrigation, and it was a square field, but just a one pivot on it, so the corners don't get irrigated. And so he had, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but he had the scenario with adding 2 inches of rain and adding 1 inch of rain and adding nothing in the corners.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe his experience was he actually got 12 bushels additional grain per inch of moisture he had added to his soybeans. So I don't know that every inch of rain would produce that consistently on every piece of land we grow soybeans on. But that does go to show us how close we were to a significant yield increase on the soybeans. The other thing that I look at as well is our earlier season crops were able to take advantage of the subsoil moisture that was still available there. And talking to guys who had been digging, whether they've been barren rock piles or tree stumps or whatever, through the winter here, we have very, very poor subsoil moisture. So going into 2019, sadly we're going to need rain no matter what we seed because we have no subsoil moisture left.
That's exactly right. And you think back to how our 2016 was, lots of water, we were super wet. We went into 2017 with our soils full of moisture, full of water. So that really helped our crop get going and keep it going throughout 2017. The difference between 2017 and 18 is that we started 18 and our tanks were pretty low. We didn't have that leftover moisture from the year before. So what we got in season was really critical this year. So that's why I think we saw big differences from where we got rain and those few spots that happened to miss the showers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely our experience around here as well.
Mm-hmm. Good. Just to keep moving along here, lack of moisture in the R stages definitely affects soybeans in different ways. So if it happens really early, just when things start flowering, you're probably going to get less flower initiation. If we start looking at this into mid-July, you're going to get some flower abortion happening. And then as we get into pod fill, what's going to happen is that you're going to lose those last flowers. And then you can also have things like smaller seed or actual seed abortion in pods. So you can have pods that were set to have 4 seeds. If it gets really dry, they might drop one of those seeds because the plant knows that it can't fill it. As well, there's several hybrids now that we have, or several varieties, that we have. They all set that big pod cluster up top. It looks really nice. When we have the moisture, there's a pile of yield that comes from up there. But sometimes on a drier year, either you'll have less of that cluster show up, or if the cluster does show up, those seeds will be smaller, or there'll only be 1 or 2 seeds in each pod up there. So that all those things can affect your yield significantly. I put some numbers in here just for comparisons. So if we have 3,200 seeds per pound, so this is a smaller seed size versus a 2,700 seeds per pound. When you're harvesting, based on if it was drought or if you had lots of water and you get big seed, that's a 16% reduction. So if there's enough seed for a 45 bushel crop, if you're doing your pod counts and your seed counts and your plant stand counts, you're trying to estimate your yield. If all of a sudden the seed comes off and it's smaller than you expected, you could see 7 bushel per acre reduction right there. So sometimes what we're seeing is not necessarily less seeds per acre coming off the field, it's just that they're smaller. So all those things can affect the yield quite a bit as well. Soren mentioned irrigating soybeans. Some of those stuff that I've seen, this is one that I read and printed off here for myself. It's just a study done by the University of Missouri. So I put that link up there. So if you guys want to go back to this webcast later and take a look, or you're curious as to things like that, you can definitely give that a read. I'll go through this real quick. Like I said, irrigation should begin by bloom and continue until the seeds are fully developed. One thing that we notice in Manitoba is you got to watch when you're watering. If you keep watering a little bit all throughout flowering and pod fill, then you're going to start looking at white mold issues. So you try and fill that tank or fill the soil beforehand, and then maybe give it another inch in season, and that should probably do it. The crop may require additional moisture via irrigation to maximize the seed weight and the yield potential. Lack of moisture during seed development can significantly reduce yields by as much as 10 bushels. We've talked about that already. The lack of moisture from beginning flowering through to beginning seed fill, so R1 through R5, can reduce the number of total pods per plant and the average number of seeds per pod. So these are all things that we talked about, and we have it under irrigating soybeans, but this is all information that would be valid just with our rainwater precipitation as it comes down as well. Between R5 and R6, lack of moisture can result in smaller seeds that have not reached their full potential. So as we mentioned before, just the fact that that seed size is smaller will affect your yield, can affect your yield quite significantly. Inoculants, just to touch on it real quick. So not all types of inoculant are equal under tough conditions. 90% of the time, a liquid in furrow will work fine, along with a good on-seed inoculant. Under drought conditions, the liquid inoculant can desiccate more easily. So what I mean there is if we have guys using, or growers out there using planters, and you are putting some liquid in furrow, on some virgin land, we do see that liquid inoculant in furrow can dry up a little bit under some conditions. So it's still very important to use multiple sources. Have a good on-seed inoculant, and then put some in furrow, or if you're using your drill, solid seeding them, and you can use a granular. That's definitely a good way to go. Granular is definitely a very nice and stable source of inoculant. So, and it doesn't desiccate or doesn't dry out. It just seems to be able to handle the tougher conditions a little bit more. So it's definitely a good idea to keep those rates up. You probably will hear, you have been to some talks where university and then pulse growers are still suggesting that after a few years you can start cutting back on inoculant levels. I'm a huge believer in a good 2-source system and keep your rates up, because for what you guys are spending on inoculant in the grand scheme of things, great insurance to have in there.
I would definitely agree with that statement. We've seen some messes out there where inoculant didn't work out, and I think that'd be about the last place I'd want to try and save money and putting in a soybean crop. because we have no proven rescue app for that. There has been studies done on top dressing nitrogen, and the results on it has been questionable, I think is fair to say.
Yeah, we have done that, and like you say, it has worked in some occurrences. Sometimes it hasn't. Kind of depends on the year and what the weather's like afterwards. So
Yeah, exactly.
that's actually kind of a nice segue into our next little slide here with nutrient availability. Just wanted to touch on a couple things. So soybean rooting can be affected by drought and compaction. So that's a couple things that we talked about. On the compaction side, like 16 going into 17, we had a really wet fall, so we had guys out there working and harrowing and trying to dry up some ground. Compaction equals poor roots typically, so that can affect your nutrient uptake. This year wasn't as bad. Where I did see some compaction issues was on some lighter soils, especially where there's some high traffic areas, and there was a bit of black soil exposed, so beans that were in some rows. I don't know if it, we had a hotter summer and the sun was beating down on that sand, and that sand got pretty darn hard in some of those areas. So that's kind of where I saw the compaction issues show up this year. The main nutrient that we see deficiencies show up in drought conditions typically is potassium in the lighter soils. Potassium moves in a soil solution to the plant, and potassium is very mobile in the plant. So it's not very mobile in the soil, but it's mobile in the plant. Deficiencies show up on the lower leaves first, because the plants are trying to move that potassium away from the older growth into the new growth. Potassium controls the opening and closing of the stomata on plants. So when you start thinking about that, when you have potash deficiencies in a drought year showing up, the deficiency can slow the process down. So the plants can't respond to that hot, dry condition as well. The stomata slow down or they stay open. So the plants are basically evapotranspirating more water. So they can end up using a little more water in those conditions. So you want to make sure if you have some levels or some potassium deficient soils, definitely don't forget about those nutrients and making sure the levels are adequate. Okay, moving into herbicide carryover risks. We talked about this last year as well with some of you. Herbicides break down in a variety of ways. So you have microbial breakdown, hydrolysis. So anything from moisture, pH, heat, all those things can affect how quickly herbicides can break down. Things like clopyralid, so your Lontrels, trifluralin, edge, many others leave residuals that can affect soybeans and corn. So this year has been quite dry again. So it slows down the breakdown of those herbicides. So the risk is also associated with rates used and the frequency of application. So if you've been using Lontrel for a few years, and the first year might be okay, you won't see any residual issues from the Lontrel or the clopyralid. But if you use it 2 years in a row, well, all of a sudden that residual is building in your soil. So you got to remember that as well. Here's a chart that was sent out. So this is how much precipitation is needed to break down the clopyralid in your soil. So for anybody that was using those chemistries, let's say on your wheat, and you go in the year after and you want to plant soybeans, you need at least 140 millimeters of rain from the time of application to probably the end of September in order to have, or in order for it to be safe to put your soybeans in the year after. So if you're using those chemistries with recropping restrictions, such as anything with some clopyralid in it, make sure that you're getting enough moisture, or you may see that show up in soybeans. And we did see it this year again, rear its ugly head. So it's just things to watch out for. This is just a couple pictures of an example of an edge of a field. As you can see inside the field, they're in a nice straight line. The beans are all looking beautiful. You look along the headlands and there's not much there. It did definitely make us think for a little bit as to what was happening. But once we started noticing, you see that ditch got cleaned out, and that dirt, this is exactly where they spread that ditch dirt. So this is a field by Fanistel, Manitoba. So we know the RMs have use different chemistries in their weed control programs. So over the years, all those herbicides just accumulated in that soil. So when they dug out that soil, threw it in the field, it probably wouldn't have affected maybe some wheat or something like that. But since it was soybeans, probably they were using something like dicamba or a clopyralid product in those ditches for a few years, and it showed up. So.
We're all sitting here getting jealous having an RM clean out a ditch, Jay. We don't do that out in this western side of the province.
That's right. These guys need to because it's so flat, it doesn't go anywhere. It'll just sit there. So
We have that problem too, but we'll leave that discussion for another day.
yeah. One thing I just wanted to mention too is last year we had a few hailstorms come through. The Manitoba, or Kristen McMillan from the U of M, along with the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers, started doing a hail trial or evaluation this year. Basically, the background behind it is because they want to try and help crop insurance be able to do a better job of rating these claims as they come in season. So the tough part about this is that these are really hard trials to do. There's lots of manual work involved. And of course, last year with the storms that we did see, some of the plots actually got hail. So all of a sudden that starts throwing the data out. Some of the things I just wanted to touch on quick though was the factors that affect yield or how your soybeans will recover from hail is the type of damage. So is it defoliation? Is it stem bruising? Is it actual stem breakage? Is it breaking the stem or the growing point off? If you have some defoliation, it's definitely not going to be the end-all be-all compared to breaking that stem right off. The amount of damage, of course, how severe it is, and the stage of the soybeans. So the later the hail event, the tougher it is for the beans to recover, of course. So a bit of defoliation early on, the soybeans can typically recover quite well if the weather's good afterwards, if they're not too stressed. But after flowering starts, if we start getting some hail at that time or in that growth stage, it's definitely going to be causing you some more issues. So numbers wise, they're still working on this. It's going to be an ongoing project. So if you guys, anybody has questions or more interest on this, definitely give Kristen, contact Kristen or the Manitoba Pulse Growers, and they can help you sort through some of that stuff as well. Quickly touching on harvest here now. Tough, prolonged harvest. As you guys know, September rolled around and we started getting rain a little bit every day. So it was definitely causing issues for us. So many days of light precipitation, the wet ground conditions leads to harvesting issues a lot of times. So we're pushing dirt with headers or getting earth tag on our beans. Things are piling up. So it's definitely tough. The upside is that the prolonged moist weather is better for seed quality than a drying and higher moisture cycle. So what I mean there is, like in the fall of 17, we had beans that got real dry, and we got a couple rains, so those beans tend to swell again, and then it got real dry again, so those beans shrink down and you start cracking seed coats. This year, the beans had dried down a little bit, but we got moisture when the beans were a little higher moisture, and once we started getting that moisture, they just kind of stayed there. So it's definitely better for seed quality, and you guys are going to probably see that or reflect on that when you go to pick up your stuff from Soren this spring. We saw some higher green seed count in areas, not everywhere, which was caused by drought or the premature ripening. It wasn't caused by an early frost. So we have seen that before where, you know, you get an early frost and you get those big green beans in your sample. These ones this time around was a little different. So the soybeans have an enzyme called chlorophyllase. That actually comes into the seed as it's maturing, and it helps to clear out the green seed content or the chlorophyll out of the seeds. Unfortunately, this year that didn't happen. The beans just died down too quick. So in those small pockets where that happened on certain maturity groups, unfortunately they had some green count. And much like your frozen beans, if there's some yellow, if you cut them in half and there's some yellow in there, they can clear out in the bin. But if they're green, if there's lots of green in them, chances are that's just how they're going to stay.
So in areas where they had the chlorophyll didn't get out of the seed, how much short were they on moisture? Because we felt we were short on moisture to produce a good soybean crop around here, but yet, to the best of my knowledge, nobody west of Brandon had that particular issue that I'm familiar with anyway, which is great. But places where they were struggling with this, they must have been significantly short on moisture.
Yeah, some of these areas we're talking.
How much they were short?
Yeah, some of these areas we're talking like 2 to 3 inches of rain throughout the growing season, so they were really dry, and a lot of that moisture came early on. So when fall came along, like those beans finished real fast and they just died, and unfortunately it locks them in. Some varieties, some varieties had it worse than others. I don't want to blame varieties too quick. It probably has more to do with the maturity of the variety and what soil type it was on than that kind of thing. So it's not a problem we see very often, it's the first time I ever see it. So Ontario's seen it a few times now, but it's just one of those years, I guess, where some guys unfortunately got blasted with that.
Well, not every crop can be the winner every year, right?
Yeah, that's right. And once again, that's the importance of getting a good balanced rotation. And we've seen some areas go from heavy canola rotations into some heavy bean rotations over the past years because we had some wet cycles. Now we might see canola acres or soybean acres move into canola or peas, things like that. My message to growers, and it has been the same overall, is find the 3, 4, 5 crops that you're good at growing, you like growing, they work well for you on your farm. Look at those crops, get them into a proper order, and then try and maintain that rotation as you go along. That's a whole other talk, getting into rotation. So just to close off, once again, we can take some questions, and wanted to recognize a few people or sites that I was able to pull some information from to get some of this presentation together. So.
Okay. I have made note of one question that came in here during the presentation. I knew it didn't really fit any of the slides you had up, so I just took note of it. In your opinion, where does beans benefit your crop rotation? I know you touched a little bit on heavy canola rotations, but as a previous crop, what benefits does a soybean have to what comes to follow the year after?
Well, where we're seeing bumps with the soybeans is that typically the year after soybeans, you're going to have a cleaner field. That soil typically is a little blacker, it's a little darker, heats up fairly well in the spring. As for, let's say, nutrients, it's not like a pea crop where you can bank on 30, 40 pounds of residual nitrogen from that pea crop being there. Typically, I don't add a lot of end credits after soybean crop, just because sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. It's kind of unreliable, so I don't typically credit it that way. The other thing is disease pressure. So if you're following it up with a canola or a wheat, canola is definitely not the best one to do it with because you do have that white mold going from one year to the next, but typically we don't see a lot of white mold in soybeans unless you're growing a wider, bushier variety and it's going on a field that's got a tight rotation ahead of time. So those are kind of the areas that I see soybeans fitting well in. It spreads out your workload as well. So typically we'll have guys growing like a cereal or a couple of cereals, like maybe wheat, oats, soybeans, and canola in a rotation. Where we have seen some heavier canola rotations, Clubroot's definitely been a huge issue here over the last little bit. So we have areas that were really heavy canola rotation that are now looking at soybeans as a way to break that up and spread that rotation out. So.
Okay. I think that's all we had for questions today, Dave. I know I interrupted you a few times throughout there, so got some decent discussion there. And for what I can see, we're actually caught up on the questions here now from the people who took in the presentation live today. I want to thank you, Dave, again for taking the time to do this webinar with us. It's going to be live on our website here, hopefully later today or tomorrow. And if anybody has any suggestions to anything else they would like to see in a webinar like this, or anything else they'd like us to kick around a bit or see if we can find some experts on, by all means, let us know. If we can't find them, maybe I'll have to ask Dave if he can help me dig up somebody who's an expert on whatever topic it may be. But and give us your feedback. Let us know what you guys think of these webinars. We have had good feedback from guys so far, hence why we're still doing it. But we'd like to know what your thoughts are on it. It's kind of new to us still, so we're still trying to tweak it and make sure it has value to everybody. So let us know what you think of it. So once again, thanks, Dave, for taking the time. It's much appreciated. And thanks everybody else for attending. And we'll be talking to you guys again soon.
Thanks for having me, Soren.
All right, thank you.